like in the TED to 2018 talk and other books, you speculate or think about remaking the beginning of the web and questioning or even dismissing ideas such as all content is free and that everyone is a publisher, right? And in fact,
No. I would only reject that content should be free. I totally rejoice in the idea of everyone being a publisher.
Okay, fine. Yeah, right. So perhaps that's not properly worded, but that's, yeah, everybody is a publisher, but not all content is free. And if we go back to Ted Nelson's vision, you recall with the transclusion, he already had this idea of people being paid with micropayments for reuse of their own contents in somebody else's docuverse, right?
Yeah.
And so one of the arguments that Tim made actually when drawing the architecture, designed the architecture, the current architecture of the web was he went away with the idea of backlinks and keeping track of those things as a simplification assumption, which made it easier to implement, but now would make it harder to make this vision concrete, right? So one thing that we'd like you to elaborate a little bit more is, would this be possible? And we know that Tim, for example, and others are proposing new architectures like solid and blockchain-based architectures. But so this question is like, well, can we use your own data as a currency, for example? And second thing would be, and then I will tie in with my previous remark, to me, the essence of the notion of web is the idea of linking contents, right? Besides me publishing stuff, which has its own value, I can also get added value by linking to somebody else's content. And I can also publish links, just the link, not the original, the source and the destination. And that's also valuable. How we factor all of these?
It's a very long question.
I'm sorry,
there's a lot of things to say about this. There was a guy named Al Gore, who was at that time a senator in the US, who came up with an idea of using some government money to get various early packet switch networks to interoperate. And this was just before Tim started the web protocol. And I was working with him at that time on different things. And I remember I had this conversation with him and a group of other people saying, you know, this whole business of having the two-way links needs to be built. It's like one of the services that just should be in the internet. Like the internet should have accounts for people, not just numbers identifying machines. And the internet should have all this stuff. And I'm saying, well, that's too hard. We'll never get there. And we need to leave that for private industry. And I'm saying, well, you know what's going to happen is private industry, people are going to come in and do the laziest thing, and the laziest thing is going to be no backlinks, and then that'll create a space for some company to come along and, because of network effects, monopolize the calculation of the backlinks, and they'll make $1 trillion. So we're giving $1 trillion gift to persons unknown because we're too lazy to just do the job right at the start. And of course that company was Google, which essentially made money by calculating the backlinks that should have been there in the architecture. So I've always viewed the thing as a gigantic debacle and a recipe for the creation of monolithic mega powers on the internet that didn't need to be there, particularly in terms of business. And so I think I like Tim a lot. I respect Tim totally. I think he made the worst architecture mistake in the history of computer science. At the time that the web protocol started, there were all kinds of people trying to do Nelsonian networks, including famously at General Magic, but many others that were going to have proper backlinks. And if you have backlinks, what you have is provenance and context for any content. Whether people get paid for it is another question, which is a matter of political economy and societal issues and philosophy and all that. I think people should get paid, because that way when the robots come, we all make more money and have more dignity instead of less and feeling obsolete. So to me, it's a spiritual question about the role of people in the future. But leaving aside whether you get paid, at least you'd have context and provenance. And what we got through the World Wide Web was a world lacking context, lacking provenance, in which gradually there's a rising tide of nonsense and trickery. The only business model available once you have no context or provenance is advertising. It's manipulation. So the web's been turned into a tool that, from a commercial point of view, is primarily for manipulating people. I think it has many other non-commercial uses, which are beautiful, but as a commercial force, it's been all about manipulating, and it's created a wave of stupid politics all over the world at once. And so I think it was a disastrous decision. This is not in any sense to condemn Tim, who, once again, I respect, and nobody could have been sure of anything back then, and a lot of opinions were legitimate. But I think it was a disaster not to do the work of including both human accounts and backlinks in the original internet, and then that was repeated with the World Wide Web, and it's only been corrected through gigantic monopolies. The backlinks were created by Google, and the accounts were created by Facebook, both of which I think have done the world more harm than good. So yeah, I think it was a crummy decision. I fully recognize that backlinks, especially at the time, given the cost of memory and the cost of computation at that time, would have been an expensive and difficult thing to do, and would have been painful. There's no question that leaving out the backlinks gave the web protocol warp speed compared to all the other competing efforts, to the point where we don't even remember them. That's all true, but virality isn't everything. I mean, just making things easy doesn't necessarily make them the right decision, and that's been a giant fallacy in the history of computer science, that we've chosen the easy way much too often, and this was a dramatic example of that.
Right. So how can we fix this or start anew? That's the million-dollar question, right?
No, at this point, it's too late to change the. I don't think it's feasible to change the web architecture in such a fundamental way. I mean, you can incrementally do things to it, as happens all the time. I think adding backlinks so that you'd reduce the value of Google, and adding human accounts so you'd reduce the value of Facebook would be very stringently opposed by Google and Facebook, who are very powerful. I mean, what's amazing to me about all this is that the original ideology was to make everything as open and easy and democratic as possible, but in fact, exactly the opposite happened. If you're in the Philippines, there is no internet, there is no web, there's only Facebook, for instance. And so you've created these mega corporations that have overwhelmed, and those things are built on the backs of the sort of volunteer, open, good-hearted world of computer science. They run OpenStacks. I mean, it's all the good intents absolutely failed spectacularly. So I think the only way forward now is actually the commercial method, which is to say that people have rights to their data and get paid for the data. And it's an idea that upsets some people, because it feels like it's like more capitalism when maybe the world already has too much capitalism. It can feel like turning people into data slaves, where they'd always have to be racing to lose their privacy in order to survive and all that. But I think that those critiques are actually partially correct. And even so, it's better than all the other available alternatives now, because the problem we have is that in order to create this illusion of everything being free but still build big businesses, the businesses could only find customers who were the advertisers. And as advertising became more and more sophisticated with the constant real-time feedback loop for people, it turned into a behavior modification scheme, so that now the whole world is being manipulated to a degree, not totally, but to a degree, by either commercial or non-commercial interests are able to use this architecture to try to screw up the world. I say screw up because the non-commercial actors online use the optimization for manipulation for their own purposes, which are often disruptive or nihilistic. So meanwhile, the companies that have become these giant inevitable monopolies because we refuse to do the architecture right in the first place, like Google and Facebook, conceive of themselves as AI companies, and they don't even think of themselves as advertising companies, which is what they would appear to be on the books. Instead, they think of themselves as giant data gatherers so that the data can be sorted into use for algorithms and robots in the future. And then meanwhile, everybody's hearing, well, you'll be replaced by a robot, you'll be replaced by an AI because they're surpassing human abilities. And this, I think, leads to this very strange relationship to technology where the new elite is being close to one of the giant computers. And I'm in that class. I've sold a company to Google and I work with Microsoft now and all that. So I'm definitely in that world benefiting from it. However, everybody else is like gradually looking at an onset of human obsolescence of just like, why am I here? And I've had students ask me, why did our parents have us? Why are we here? If AI is going to take over, Google says AI is going to take over. And so the obvious solution to this is to reformulate our perspective and say, wait a second, AI is just a way of using people's data. And that is, in fact, what it is. It's a way of taking data and turning the data into some kind of result. And the data mostly comes from people. So if people get paid for the data, then the more AI there is, the more people have relevance. And in fact, what I think will happen is that people will discover that they can find pride in making better and better data to run the robots. And furthermore, once they have the dignity and the power of being acknowledged in the system instead of being ignored by the system, once their contribution is on the books instead of ignored, instead of pretending that they're not valuable, they'll have the power to then create their own privacy. As soon as workers have power, when they're getting paid, they can organize. When they can organize, they can reduce their hours. So it might sound paradoxical, but paying people for data is actually the only path for them to eventually have some degree, some control of their privacy. Otherwise, there's no privacy because nobody even knows what's going on. And currently, we don't know what's going on. You don't know how much privacy you have, and you're a computer science professor. I don't know how much I have, and I'm a computer scientist who's worked with the tech giants. Nobody knows. It's just, but as soon as people are paid, then it's on the books. Then you know. And
so, but you mean paid and publicly known? When you say it's on the books, I mean,
it's on the books in the sense that you get paid. It doesn't mean that you're publicly known. Your degree of publicity, I think, would be a different question.
Right.
The thing about money that's interesting, and by money, I'm going to use a very broad definition of money that might include future elaborations that are not money as we know it. That might be some kind of blockchain thing or something. The idea, though, is that you have some token, and the token has a degree of entropy. It has a degree of information loss that people have agreed to through social coordination, and it has a degree of information retention. And whatever that balance is determined by the society. A very interesting thing about money is you can get money that might have, if you could trace it, pass through the hands of your enemies, but you don't need to know that. So it can create a kind of a cohesion through abstraction that's very hard for people to achieve otherwise. Money can also allow you to live in different ways. You might say, I want to treat money as a form of privacy. I don't want you to know how I spend my money. I don't want you to know how I earned it. And that's feasible as long as there wasn't a crime. There has to be some way for investigators to find out if you stole it or whatever, or forged it. But in principle, it actually can be a tool of privacy or not. You can say, like our President Trump does, I'm rich. He's not even, he's lying, but it doesn't matter. You can use it for publicity or for non-publicity. So the question, this issue of what's exposed and what's private and what's public is very different for me than the question of fundamental dignity. Like fundamental dignity means that you have some ability to make informed choices about your life, to make your own choices, and for them to be different from others, and not to have them made for you by opaque organizations. And we're not giving people that dignity now.
Yeah, so when you were saying money, it's probably you mean currency, some sort of currency. And what Bebo was asking about, you could even use your own data as currency, right? Or not?
That's a really interesting question. So there have been many debates about this. My my main economics colleagues and I have come to believe that that's not quite the right formulation. So we wrote a paper that's somewhat, if I may say so, somewhat famous a few years ago called Data as Labor, where instead of treating data as capital, you think of it more like labor. In other words, it's your the data is your personal value. It's not, we don't think it should be tradable. In other words, we actually think that you shouldn't be able to sell your data per se. You should only be able to license it. We think you should have a moral right to your data that's eternal. We think your data is part of you. It's very personal, it's very tender. And I think you should, I think it's reasonable for society to say, you have to come up with some trade-off where you're contributing to be part of the society. And if it's an advanced society with a lot of robots and AI algorithms, then contributing some of your data would be one of the major ways that people would contribute to be part of that society. However, that doesn't mean that the data could ever be sold in forever, or in some, the term sale is wrong and the term currency is wrong. It's labor, and there's nothing wrong with people working. You know, the question is, what's the transaction, what's the level of choice that somebody has, and what's the level of dignity they have when they work? And so a worker should have rights, a worker should have choices, and so on. And so we think of data as being like labor in that sense. So we don't think of the data itself as the currency. The currency might be what you get once you've licensed your data, and that is something we're very interested in.
And how do you treat then links in this context, right? Establishing connections, and eventually links can be seen as data themselves, right?
Yeah, and so, which is great, and that's a very old idea at this point. Of course, that was in As We May Think, and
Right.
it was, of course, in Ted Nelson.
I'm bringing it back, yeah.
Yeah. So what Ted Nelson had proposed is a backward tree of contributors to values, so that if you have something that incorporates through a link or through some other means work from others, there's some way in which they get a little bit of trickle down if you make money from that accumulation. And that would be true for somebody who creates a stream of links or a collection of links where the people whose links are components would still make a little bit of money from it. So somebody who's a search result on Google would make a little bit of money if Google makes money from revealing that search result. And that, I mean, there's a kind of an interesting thing about that, because I sometimes get responses saying, no, that should be barter. That should be where capitalism ends, and those people should just be glad that Google sent them traffic. But I contend that that's quite wrong. If somebody wants to propose a non-market system, and I'm open-minded about that. Like, maybe we can leverage networks to create non-market systems where, instead of having any kind of currency, we're all voting on things or something. If a society can be built without a market, I'm open-minded about it. But for the moment, people have to pay for food, they have to pay for rent, they have to live in a market economy. And so if one of the fundamental ideas about a market economy is that economies grow, and that just because one person makes money, it doesn't mean that it was taken away in a zero-sum game from other people, but rather the economy grows. If it were only a zero-sum game, it would be much harder to argue for any utility in markets, right? If it was nothing but optimized distribution, then it would just seem like a system of winners and losers, and it wouldn't be sustainable. But if markets can grow, then you can have a win-win non-zero sum result, right? And that's what people who believe in markets believe in. Personally, I think it does happen. It doesn't always happen. I think it's a property of markets that's not entirely reliable, but is also real when it's real. But leaving that aside, if you believe that markets are ever viable, then you should believe that paying those people just because their link was included in your search result should grow the economy and actually benefit you as well. There's a question of how much to pay them, and that's where economics comes in, and you have to figure that out. But I think this notion that not paying people is, I mean, it always will come back to bite. And so one of the things that's strange about the big tech companies is that they have these crazy market valuations, which is a lot of why they're rich. And the reason for that is that investors believe they'll just take over everything, which is probably true. But at the end of the day, at some point, there's only so much you can take over. And when you hit that point, having not paid all those other people will mean, you have a much lower customer base than you should have, and you'll hit a wall of poverty at the end of this long climb. And that seems to me to be basic economics. And so a lot of people in Silicon Valley are aware of that problem, but figure, well, it's so far in the future that by then everything will have been reshuffled anyway, which might be true. But if we're going to reshuffle things, let's reshuffle them so that there's broad dignity and not just a few people owning the robots that do everything else and everybody else feeling useful, even though they actually are useful because it's their very data that's programming the robots, So the ideal solution, anyway, so at this, if we were back in 1989 or something, I try to argue with Tim and I say, oh my God, you've got to do the backlinks. You've got to do the backlinks. And I would do everything possible. And I did actually, but now that we're in 2020, I think the only path forward is workers' rights for everybody who makes data, which is everybody. Your data is your labor. You should have moral rights to it. They should be inseverable, and you should have commercial rights to it, and that has to be inseverable. And that's the path forward. That's the only path forward I can see at this point.
Anybody want to ask the question about the social networks?
Actually, I put myself on mute because there's a lot of background noise here. So why don't you go ahead?
Okay. Yeah, I got the points you're making. But then you also advocate that we should get out of social networks, right? But I think people need some sort of.
No. Let's be very careful here.
Okay.
I've never said that social networks in themselves are the problem. What I'm talking about is the advertising-based ones.
Okay.
And they happen to be dominant monopolies, so there's not really any choice. My problem is not with the idea of social networking. And in fact, as I've pointed out in everything I've ever written about this, there are many very beautiful things about social networking. And I think particularly right now during this period of a lot of us being stuck because of the virus, the importance of those things come out. The part that I do object to very, very, very strongly is the manipulation-based economy that has dominated social networking. So the problem I have is when you talk to somebody else over Facebook or any of the Facebook things like WhatsApp or any of these other commercial apps, it's being financed entirely by people who at least believe they'll be able to manipulate you. It's financed by people who believe they'll change your behavior, and it's populated mostly by fake entities, and most of the fake entities are created by malicious forces who want to destroy your society. Everything I just said is incontrovertibly true. And so that's a system that I think is incredibly stupid. But if you leave all that aside and you just look at the core value of social networking, of people connecting together, that's beautiful. And that I think it would be ridiculous to have an objection to that. I mean,
yeah.
I think people often get their targets mixed up when they worry about the modern internet and web situation. A lot of times they'll say, oh, screens are bad. Is screen time bad for you? Well, maybe a little, but it can't be that bad. I mean, is social networking bad for you? Well, not in its core. What's really bad is the business model, what's called the advertising business model, but it's really a behavior manipulation model.
But
that's
even if you,
problem.
even if you consider, I understand your point, and I'd be curious to understand how would you envision a proper social network with the references within the framework that you're thinking of?
So I think we have examples of some that are better than others already. My current example of one that I think could be a template for future ones is Github. So Github has a little bit of the poison that you see online so much. It does have bad actors. It does have, but mostly it doesn't. Mostly people on GitHub have a pretty good attitude. Mostly they're getting things done. Mostly the world is better for their work. Mostly they're developing relationships that are persistent and very positive. It's mostly very geeky and nerdy. but not entirely. It's broadening a little bit. And what I observe about it is a few things. One is the principal motivation comes from the people themselves, not from outside forces who are hidden to the side, who are pouring money in it to try to manipulate them. So A is it's primarily self-driven and not manipulated by third parties. B, people have a real stake in it, so it's not bullshit, if I can say that in an academic conference, instead of it being like, oh, my vacation pictures are prettier than yours, or whatever the bullshit is of the moment. It's kind of about real stuff. Like, we have this project, we have to get it working, you know, and so there's something, reality can make people better. Reality can be a positive force. So it's self-driven, it's based on reality, and it's self-organized. It's not there's not some algorithm saying, oh, hey, you're the person who should work with that person, and then you should look at this project. There's not some algorithm deciding who knows who and what should happen. People organize based on themselves. They bring it in, and when people do something, they know they did it, and other people know they did it. So there's this dignity, there's this provenance. It has that provenance. And so all of those things are different from any of the Facebook properties, or Twitter or YouTube or any of the other ones that there are. And so I think that's the path forward. There we can see a good living example.
But you touched about two things which I think are crucial here, is that social networks tie together communities in a sense, right? Mm-hmm. And some communities have a better or a clearer definition of what binds them together. So in your example, it's geeky, GitHub is geeky and so on, because, and you say they touch reality. Reality in this case means developing systems and so on, which is pretty concrete, and people involved in that agree as a community, that's what we're gonna focus on, fine. And you can argue that like LinkedIn in a certain sense has a similar
LinkedIn is a fuzzier case. LinkedIn has a little bit.
I understand. I just want to give.
Yeah.
Right, but I want to make the distinction between what I would call a special purpose community, where that's clear, and we can have gradations of those, as opposed to general purpose like Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, where anything goes. It's not clear why you're there. Everyone has its own idea of why, and that makes it more amenable to these misuses and these distortions.
Well, once again, what we do not have is we do not have a popular general purpose social media platform that isn't driven by manipulators and isn't dominated by fake accounts. And so if we had that, it would be much easier to have this conversation, because we could point to it and say, what can we learn from it? But that does not currently exist. Only tiny experimental ones with no scale exist. And there are many, many of those, thousands, but there's not a single one of any scale. I'll give you one example that came up in the last couple of years, though, that I think gives us a tiny bit of comparison. TikTok, until fairly recently, didn't show a lot of influence from fake accounts and malicious, nihilistic, ugly, weird, paranoid content. And it was actually for a long time pretty fun. And you might ask, well, how is that possible? And the reason why is that its fundamental economic driver was not Wall Street, but the Chinese Communist Party. Now, I really dislike the Chinese Communist Party, but their primary interest is insulting Hong Kong and Taiwan and Falun Gong and Uyghurs and Tibetans and so on. They have a different issue, which is also horrible. They're more interested in political censorship, kind of old school. But this whole making the whole world crazy and ugly so society falls apart is not their main thing. Whereas the fake bots that comprise almost the entirety of new accounts on a given day on any Facebook brand, that's exactly what they're doing. And so you suddenly had this platform that for a little while was more positive. It hasn't really lasted. The fake bots got away into it and have started to make it dark. But if you look at it, it was actually the only one not driven by the commercial manipulation for hire plan, but instead the old school communist news censorship centralization plan, which is no more attractive, but it did give us a point of comparison where there could be a sort of, if you like, for our purposes, just in a little bubble, an innocent social network for a year or two. And I think it was better, weirdly.
But you also touched, that was the second part of my observation on the problem of scale, right?
Mm-hmm.
So let's just set aside or ignore for just a second the financial incentives and such and manipulation objectives, and look at it simply from a scale management point of view. I get, if I am successful, the network is successful, I'm going to be potentially exposed to a huge number of items, right, that are being published, that are being exchanged, that in virtue of my social connections in that network, I should at least in principle be looking at or being exposed to, which is in practice impossible, right? So it stands to reason that the platform helped me in some way to filter that down or prioritize, because my cognition is limited. I just cannot cope with that amount of information.
That's a false choice. There's a third option that is vastly superior to either of the two that you just mentioned.
Right.
And so, this is what we call the MIDS solution. There's a long history of scholars trying to figure out why some societies are more successful than others and what makes for a decent society. Hannah Arendt is a good example of somebody who's looked at this. And in the United States, we think a lot about a Frenchman named Tocqueville, de Tocqueville. There's an interesting theme that emerges universally across centuries of people who have been interested in this thing, which is that it's neither just from the top nor just from the bottom. Like, you can't just hope for a good king, nor can you have like some citizenry that's well educated and great. There's this other thing you need that really seems to be the determining factor, and it's what we call societal institutions. So societal institutions are not as big as the whole society, nor as small as an individual or a family. They're in between size. A good example would be the university where you work.
Right, I understand.
Also things like newspapers, even soccer clubs, all kinds of things. And these things create the, I have a technical term for them. I call them the coarse-grained accumulators. And let me explain what I mean by that. In any learning system, you can't just have a scattering of tiny elements and then some central hub. You need to have these in-between size structures that accumulate the results of medium-sized experiments because you can't do large-scale experiments because you can't run reality multiple times and the organism just dies. Let me give you two examples of coarse-grained accumulators to give you an idea of what I mean. In evolution, we have species. Right? So the species is this thing that is not the whole of the biosphere, and it's not just a single piece of genetic material. It's this in-between size thing, and it asks a question that's pretty complicated, but not as complicated as the whole Gaia. And without that, evolution couldn't happen in the creative way it does. You need species. But here's another example from computer science. If you want to do what we call a neural network, which I think is an unfortunate term, but if we want to do a learning network, you have to have intermediate layers. If you don't have intermediate layers, you cannot have a learning system. And although the function is different, there's a metaphor in a broad sense between the intermediate layer and the species in evolution. And so these intermediate sized organizations in society are the engines of functionality, learning, and decency in that society. Now, what happened, because the way we created first the internet and then the web was absolutely destructive to these things. When Facebook said move fast and break things, what they were breaking were these intermediate sized things. They broke the newspapers, they weakened schools, they broke intermediate sized specialized organizations of all kinds. Everybody had to go on Facebook or WhatsApp or Instagram or whatever. And so when you lose those things, there's a couple of things that happen. First of all, in any democracy, one of the important principles is free association, right? And free association is actually all about these societal intermediate structures. the institutions are entered into freely, but then they become snobbish, right? Once you like
well, network theory has this notion of preferential attachment and supernodes, that if you let that happen, they occur. You do get
well,
those supernodes, right?
well, I'm sorry I've talked too long. This is a big idea. I wanted to say a little bit more about it.
Okay.
If you look at, so one of Facebook's problems right now, or Google and YouTube's problems, is that people are petitioning them to become censors for the whole of society. You have to keep the fascists out. You have to keep the old boyfriend seeking revenge out. You have to keep the Russian trolls who are trying to destroy our societies out. You have to do this and that and that. And of course, at the end of that road, it's absurd because we're like begging these corporations to become our masters. I mean, but they hate it because they can never succeed. No matter what they do, somebody's going to think they did it terribly. So they're in this horrible position, and the whole setup is really stupid. So what's a better idea? The better idea is that there are established intermediate-sized things like newspapers and TV stations that develop brands, they develop reputations, and even though nobody's forced to join them, it's all through free association. Within them, it's no longer anything goes. They have their own ideas about quality. The university doesn't submit bullshit research papers that are going to get rejected. The university cares about its quality. The scientific community cares about the quality of its publications. The soccer team cares about the quality of its players. They're just not going to let anybody play, right? So as soon as you have these structures, all of a sudden you have a way for people to voluntarily get together. Nobody's forced to join, but you have these things that develop quality, and all of a sudden things get better. All of a sudden science gets better, soccer gets better, all these things get better. And these are exactly, and so so if I was going to recreate the web and deal with these problems of all the terrible information and also the information overload, I would emphasize MIDs. I would say that that you can post anything, but you do it through a MID, and you have to get accepted by a MID. And you might say, oh, this is horrible. Why shouldn't I just be able to do this? You can start your own MID. There's no restriction here. If you and your friends feel like you're not getting heard, start your own MID. But the thing is, then the MIDs compete for brand and reputation, and all of a sudden you have a quality method, and you'll have both a much better funnel so that the amount of information is higher quality and better organized. There'll be less clickbait, less stupid stuff, less repetition.
Well, but won't this competition be also vulnerable to the same kinds of low-level manipulation that we were talking about?
No, not at all. Not at all. You're the various nihilists online can force garbage into your feed and do all the time. The various commercial interests can try to tilt you so that you feel a little happier after you buy a certain product and sadder after you buy another product, which does happen, at least according to Facebook's own publications about its practices. But those same forces can't force you to give a degree to a student who hasn't earned it. They can't force a soccer club to put somebody on the field who's a terrible player. What you do is you have power that becomes part of a smaller thing that can actually understand what it's doing instead of just coming from this giant.
I understand that at the mid-level, but for instance, if you look at the media landscape today, right? So within one publication or newspaper, news organization, all of the things you described apply. However, they are also competing in the overall market, and you do find other kinds of media that try to have their own environments, their own ecosystems, and these ecosystems compete with each other often.
Yeah.
Right? And they lead sometimes to polarization as well, or I'm not sure which comes first, right?
So, you know, I've been thinking a lot about this question. It's a very important question. So, I know a little bit about media in Brazil. I love Brazil, by the way. I love going there.
But it's not just Brazil. I understand.
But I know the United States better. And in the United States, we have one television network that's incredibly influential, that has the majority of especially older viewers, that's very aligned with the present government, and often has what seems to others to be pretty low standards in terms of fact checking and whatnot.
Right.
Okay, so and that's Fox, if we were to name it. All right.
So yeah, it's clear.
But the thing about it, and here's the question I have: would Fox be the way it is without the internet being the way it is? See, I think that the dysfunction, what I view as the dysfunction on Fox, and I've appeared on Fox occasionally as a commentator and stuff. I don't think they're like some horrible people to be shunned or anything like that, but I do think that it's often quite dysfunctional from the perspective of news quality. And I think that if it wasn't adjacent to a dysfunctional internet, it would be much harder for it to be dysfunctional in the way it is. Because what happens is there are weird half-truths or paranoid rumors or strange conspiracy theories that grow in the online world until there's enough of an audience that it incentivizes the Fox broadcasters to speak to that audience. But I don't think that stuff would be there. I think it's the feeder for the worst parts of Fox. And I think if the internet was improved, Fox would also improve. Now, there are counterexamples. You can argue against what I'm saying because you can say there's always been bad media. But I still think that having competing media is better than having a global mush that becomes dominated by whoever can be the most paranoid and the most irritating. So as bad as Fox is, it's still better than a lot of what you see online.
Well, I use media as an example.
Yeah.
I use media as an example of a mid in your concept. I'm just trying to think through the idea that having a mid, what's to prevent this intermediate level of abstraction, if you will, to suffer the same phenomena, influences that happen at the lower level of abstraction.
It's because mids reputation is more important and more persistent for mids than it is for individuals. So if a school gets a bad reputation, students don't go there anymore and people don't hire students from it. So that's the key thing. It's that mids become brands. They become known, and they have when they go through periods of mistake or failure, which are inevitable. They have to fight to overcome them, and they're motivated to. So once again, if a soccer team has a losing streak, either the fans will forget about it and go to a different soccer team when it dies, or else they'll get their act together and improve eventually or something. But they don't just sit there and say, oh, it's great, we're terrible, we'll just be terrible forever. You know, that's just not something that happens, because they have a reputation that they care about. And I think it's a magic mechanism, and I think it mostly works.
Yeah, well, it's hard to counter-argue with that.
It's because it's true. If you weren't from Brazil, maybe I wouldn't be using soccer as my example, but it's somehow
no.
The right example.
You can talk. You were talking about that. I was thinking of the 49ers. So.
Yeah. Okay, that's fine.
Or Golden State Warriors.
Or like anything. Once you become part of something, you and the other people have a shared stake to make that thing good. Like another one like that is UC Berkeley. Like I will do anything to make sure UC Berkeley's reputation is good because I'm connected to it, and I don't want it to have to suffer the humiliation of having some paper withdrawn because it was bad or something like that. Like we all it's something that you start working on, and it's a different feeling.
Yeah. So it's still not clear to me whether, in some sense, and this relates to the idea that the web and the internet are engineered environments, right? And in part, we're discussing design flaws in creating these artificial environments, right?
One thing we should be clear about is that the web's primary effect, and I shouldn't say the web because this is a problem that was born in the initial internet project, and then it was amplified by the web protocol. but this idea that your core platform doesn't really do the things that are necessary for it to function. So it doesn't include accounts or backlinks and stuff. So very, very few people these days experience the web directly. For instance, when 20 years ago, when I'd ask for a show of hands of how many college students had their own web pages, most of the hands went up. If I do it now, I haven't seen a hand go up in a long time. It's a very rare thing. So they don't make their own web pages. What they mostly do is use the web just to go from one very big company domain to another. And within those domains, their experiences are not the web at all. They experience a world in which there is provenance. There are backlinks on everything on Google, and Facebook has backlinks. Everything has accounts. Everything has provenance and memory. It's just that they're not honest. They're all faked up and manipulated to serve a commercial model that's deeply corrupt and inhumane. But the web itself is rarely experienced. I still do. I like finding those little personal websites, and I go to, of course, in the academic world, we still use the web a lot. But out there in the real world, not so much. People are mostly
not to mention all the apps on the phones, which are.
Yeah, and the phone, that's something that Apple brought to the table. Apple brought to the table this idea that on your phone, you're living in this curated world, and that's absolutely correct. That's and that, of course, dovetailed with the other stuff I'm talking about. So the weird thing is that the web was taken over. It became food for monsters, and it's very rarely experienced in anything like its intended form these days.
Yeah, I was just wondering with my question whether in order to, so MIDs are not engineered. If I got it correctly, they kind of appear in some sense naturally because of this need for, well, because probably quality rewards survival.
There was some audio that cut out, so I'm not sure. What is it that appears?
MIDs.
Oh, well, MIDs can only come into existence through societal design. There have to be laws. MIDs are a little bit, if data is labor, then MIDs are a little bit like a labor union, in a sense. They have to come about through both the top and the bottom at the same time. There have to be laws to support them, and people have to also voluntarily decide they want to be part of them. Therefore, they're not going to happen tomorrow. However, I don't know, given everything that's happened with the pandemic and all, I'm not sure if it'll, but this year, perhaps we might have a law supporting MIDs on the books in California, and there are already a few experimental ones in other parts of the world. I think we have a preliminary version already in the Netherlands and other places, Canada. So I think that the laws to support MIDs will start appearing, and then there has to be the societal education, and so that people can decide if they like this idea and want to try it.
And are there any architectural design issues that should be present to make sure that MIDs work properly?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So if I was God and I could just design the architecture that I want, I would have, it would look a little bit like Ted Nelson's original idea, but fancier. I'd have support for all kinds of transactions at the base. I'd have smart transactions that have algorithmic that persistence. I'd have, oh man, I'd have all kinds of stuff in them, but I don't think that's realistic. So what has to happen instead?
Smart contracts?
That's a term of art these days. I don't like the term. I think the term smart is a horrible term that's misapplied. But every time you call something smart, it means that somebody didn't design it well. But anyway, smart contracts mean that when you make a contract with somebody, instead of it just being written in words, there's an algorithm that
evaluates.
Yeah, and you can run it in simulation in advance for different circumstances, and the algorithm persists for as long as any exchange related to the transaction persists. And of course, contracts are algorithms, but this would just be more explicitly so. And a lot of the energy for making these types of things comes from the blockchain community, because there's just a lot of energetic people in that community. But I think what'll have to happen is the mids will create a new network among themselves to support their interests. That'll happen at some point. The World Wide Web, I think it's too politically difficult to improve it in the most fundamental ways that I wish it could be improved. It used to be that what made it hard was the absolutists in the technical community, who were sort of some combination of, so they were somehow both communist and libertarian at the same time. But now it's not that. It's more that you can't do anything without the cooperation of the giant platforms like Google and Facebook. And I think realistically, the most important improvements to the World Wide Web would be counter to the interests of those two companies in particular, perhaps even to Amazon. I'm not sure. That's a more complicated question. And so with their opposition, it'd be very hard at this point to make progress. I mean, if for some reason the World Wide Web changed in some way that Facebook didn't like, I honestly think Facebook could just kill it. Why does Facebook need it? They would just go to everybody who makes a browser and say, talk to us or die, and screw the World Wide Web. So, I mean, that's the reality of where we've come to.
Guys, as I said, I've been a little quiet because it's too noisy around here. But I think that we're certainly at the,
what do you mean?
Yeah, we're certainly at the point where, you know, can we reach some sort of summary or takeaways, you know, about the future of the web? You know, what we'd like to see, what we realistically might see.
Yeah, remember this. The session is supposed to be web at 30 and looking ahead. So.
Well, I would love to see the web become, I've criticized it over the lack of backlinks and accounts and all that, but I would rather see the web as the universal activity be the central part of people's online experience instead of the companies like your Facebook or your Zoom even. I'd like people to have a non-commercial account as their fundamental account. I'd like for people to have a non-commercial identity as their fundamental identity. And you might say, hey, weren't you the guy just saying everything should get more commercial? I'm like, well, commercial with rights. Like you can't, if the commerce is entirely inside a company store, you're not a first-class participant. So I'd like to see people be first-class participants, which means that they have identities that aren't tied to a particular company. I'd like to see people be paid more when their data is used. I'd like to see them pay more so that there's an alternative to them being manipulated as a way for things to get financed. This is another thing we didn't talk about. If you look at the cases where people do pay for content like Netflix, it tends to be better, which validates one of the hypotheses of people who like markets, that they can actually create improvement. I don't think it's always true, but it certainly has been in this case. And I'd like to see people get used to paying for stuff online in concert with them getting paid. And I'd like the internet to become more of an engine for broad economic growth for everybody, not just for a narrow band of society. I'd like the web to become the kind of public resource that it was meant to be, instead of just an on-ramp for gigantic monopolies. I'd love that. That's the future.
Who would support this infrastructure? How would this infrastructure be supported in this case?
Well, you know,
would this be a public service?
I think it could be a public service, or it could just get there could be an internet tax that doesn't go to governments, but to the web as an infrastructure all over the world. I mean, I don't know if you remember, but a few years ago, there were some internet services that were starting to fail from lack of maintenance, and it turns out that the volunteer open source people who were responsible for them were practically starving, and this was like this infrastructure in which the richest companies in history depend, you know, and it's an absurd situation. So I think having a small fund that would come out of if we had commerce online as a general thing, having a little bit of it support the online world would make a lot of sense. Why not?
Sort of like the tax for that the British citizens pay for BBC or.
Yeah, and I've spent time in the UK, and that's people have their complaints about it. They don't like having enforcers run around to see if somebody legitimately paid for their access to the public television service. All that, there's a certain amount of bullshit when you do that. I'm sorry I've said bullshit so many times. It's pardon me, but at any rate, there's no such thing as a perfect system. But overall, the BBC's better than Fox News. Let's say. I mean, it is actually a pretty.
But
good
I wasn't comparing the BBC itself, but the principle that there is a common good.
Yeah.
That is supported. It's a service that is like you pay for health systems, well, over there at least, and they're like services provided to the society at large. And then, you know, this infrastructure to support the web as you envision it would be part of it.
And, you know, I want to say something else just about society in general. What you see online is the same thing that you see offline, where a lot of culturally valuable things like fashion, oh, I shouldn't point to this t-shirt as fashion, but you get the idea, like fashion or music, beats, all these things, they often come from poor neighborhoods and they take over the world, and the people who originate them are often not the people who make the money from them. One of the things I'd like to see is a world in which where there is provenance, and if some kid comes up with some great beat in a favela up the hill there behind you in that beautiful picture, they get they become stars, you know, instead of just getting ripped off. I think what we discover is that there's a much wider distribution of points of genius in the world than we currently acknowledge, and I think it would be a really healthy thing for the world. I think it would be really I think this world of people, just of everything being free and anonymized and slushed around by algorithms, it's promoted as this kind of empowerment, but in fact, it's exactly the opposite. And that's a whole other, I haven't gone into the politics of it, but I think it's been politically massively a failure. So I'd love to see that reversed.
Okay. Bebo, you have any?
No, I was just, you were asking about how such a network would be supported. Going back to this sort of naive idea at the beginning, for some reason I was thinking about, the ham radio network, or even Fido. You remember Fido, Jaron?
Mm-hmm.
Where basically it was people that were supporting the network, not AT&T and not the large companies that were buying up all the fiber. It was actually the people.
Well, maybe we'll get there again. Maybe it'll happen. I'd like it. I mean, I like the internet. I like it, despite all my complaints about it. I'm glad it's there, and I just wish we could make it less creepy. And I think we can. Oh, hey, can I add one other topic? This deserves a whole other hour, and I can't do that other hour. I have to go actually in a minute. But one of the things I've worked on the most is virtual reality, and one of the things that we've never gotten right is the virtual reality web, some kind of wide area shared virtual reality. And every time, and here I also want to be as nice and gentle as I can, but people tend to do extensions to HTML to support virtual reality that conceive of virtual reality in an overly static way, as like, well, here's some geometry or something like that, or here we can share models. And some kind of future version of the web has to be very good at sharing real-time flows of like gestures and expressions and dynamics and shared simulations and models. That's where the action really is, and that's where there's still a wide open problem waiting to be solved. So for young people getting into it, that's a great area to work in.
Yeah. Definitely.
That's it. That's all I can tell you.